Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome from Brussels to our event entitled Gendered Disinformation: How Should Democracies Respond to this Threat? My name is Eva van der Rakt, and I am the director of the European Union office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Brussels. The Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung is a German political foundation affiliated with the German Green Party. Its primary task is political education and advocacy in Germany and abroad. And in our work, in our international work, we place particular emphasis on gender equality and diversity. During our today's debate, we would like to focus on gendered disinformation and underline the necessity to consider gender aspects when analyzing any type of disinformation. Gender disinformation is disinformation that weaponizes gender stereotypes. It is a form of violence particularly used against politically active women and poses a serious barrier to gender justice and democracy online. Unfortunately, and I have to stress that, it often represents a significant reason why many women quit their political careers. Hate and online threats fueled by gender disinformation campaigns are in some cases followed by physical violence. However, it is not being widely recognized in policy responses to online risks and threats. In the context of the updated EU Code of Practice on Disinformation, the Digital Services Act package, and the UK's Online Safety Bill, we are convinced that it is of utmost importance to look at how the EU and UK should respond to the threat of gendered disinformation. And we are very pleased that we can address these challenges together with our UK-based partner organization, Demos. During our event, we would like to discuss the following questions. How can we improve responses to gender disinformation online? What can platforms do better? What kind of government regulation may be needed? And are the current proposals on the table sufficient? How can international cooperation support better responses to gender disinformation? And last not least, how can we best support those affected by gendered disinformation, especially women? I am very pleased that 5 inspiring women and distinguished speakers accepted our invitation to join our debate. They all have been confronted with gender disinformation as politicians, activists, and researchers. I would like to thank them for sharing their insights with us. I would also like to thank our partner organization, Demos, for the excellent cooperation. In closing, please allow me to mention that we have just launched a web dossier on homegrown state-sponsored disinformation in Europe, where we will also include articles and contributions on gendered disinformation. You can find the link to the dossier in the chat. It is now my honor to pass the floor to Ellen Judson, who is senior researcher at Demos and the moderator of our event. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion, and thank you very much for your attention. Ellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Really delighted to be here with you all. My name's Ellen. I'm a senior researcher at the think tank Demos in the UK. I work with our digital research team called Chasm, and much of our work is really looking at how can we build a more empowering, a more inclusive democratic internet, and how do we deal with the threats to that? And we've been doing work looking at gender disinformation as a specific threat to this vision of the good web that we want to work towards, and we want to find out what we can do about it. So before we start the discussion, a couple of small housekeeping things. This event is being recorded, and you'll be able to watch it along with other events in this series on the Heinrich-Böll Foundation's YouTube channel. If you have any questions for the panel as we go along, please do put them in the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. We'll come to them after a bit of initial discussion. You can upvote other people's questions if there's particular issues you want to see raised. And we also have the chat open. We'd love you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know what your interests are, what you're working on, share links to things other people might find interesting, get to know each other, all as if we were all round a coffee table in real life. So I will introduce our wonderful panel today. So we have Gwendolyn Delbos-Corfield, MEP. She's the Vice President of the Greens EFA Parliamentary Group and involved with the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, as well as the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in Democratic Processes in the European Union. We're also joined by Alexandra Geza, MEP, Shadow Rapporteur for the Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection, and she's responsible for the Digital Services Act on behalf of the Greens EFA Parliamentary Group. We have Maria Giovanna Sessa here. She's a researcher at EU Disinfo Lab. She's worked on a range of projects on misinformation and looking at how gendered disinformation has been evolving during the COVID-19 pandemic. Shamaila Khan is Director of Research and Policy at Digital Rights Foundation, where she's currently working on a global consultation looking at gendered disinformation, and she's managed a helpline for those affected by cyber harassment and has a background in law, technology, and gender. And then finally, we have Christina Wilfor. Christina is a specialist in responding to disinformation and how we can improve the quality of elections to bring new voices into politics. She's co-founded the Women's Disinformation Defense Project, as well as #ShePersisted, which is a cross-national initiative to tackle gendered disinformation, as well as online attacks against women in politics. So really looking forward to this discussion. We're going to touch a bit on first what gendered disinformation means, then move on to looking at its impact, and then how we can tackle it. We're really lucky to have 5 amazing speakers, so time will be a little tight, so I'd ask speakers to keep remarks to a couple of minutes. And we're going to start with bringing in kind of civil society expert view to kind of explain to everyone what we mean by gender disinformation, and then bring in our political leaders to talk more about the political impact and what can be done. So great to see everybody introducing themselves in the chat. Do carry on. But without further ado, we'll turn to our discussion. So first up, we've all heard about fake news, disinformation, all of these threats to democracy and lies about elections and so forth. But when we say gendered disinformation, what are we talking about specifically? What does it really look like, and how can we recognize it? And Christina, I wonder if I could come to you first to just kind of set out the terms of what are we talking about and how should people be responding? Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just put out a few words in terms of the framework here. And thank you for organizing this session. It's really an honor to be on it with many talented individuals who are doing pretty amazing work in this. So if we look at just the definition, the gender disinformation is the spread of deceptive or inaccurate information and images against women in political life, or it can be journalists, female public figures, following on storylines that draw on misogyny, as well as gender stereotypes about the role of women. So this is really designed to alter public understanding of female politicians' track records and to move them out of politics. So it's different than just online harassment, but there's a whole set of issues going on when we look at the threat landscape for women leaders that really tap into and play on sexist attitudes, but could be organized in the form of either online violence, threats and direct harassment. Sort of political campaigning is when a lot of it comes out. The disinformation aspect of this, though, is when it's really weaponized with a series of bad actors or who are using a variety of means and often artificial activity. What we've seen really through the research is this problem continue to get worse, and our documentation of it continuing to get better. So there's many different types of evidence-based research I would point to that qualifies the problem. What we saw in the 2020 election in particular is that this was having a damaging effect on even primary candidates and really playing on narratives that concerned their character, and we could really compare it against male candidates running in the same race. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue did another set of research to really qualify what we're seeing, and what we really saw from the US Congress is that female politicians are more likely to suffer from this high level of online abuse than their male counterparts across party lines, and worse for women of color, and worse for ethnic minorities and religious minorities. The themes of gender disinformation can go in this direction. They really fall into the buckets of what I would say 3 main issues that have to deal with qualifications. So the unqualified, she's unlikable and untrustworthy. So that whether that's calling someone dumb or a liar or weak, it really goes to those 3 areas. The goal, and this is, I think, what is not always understood when we look at the issue of just online violence, but when we step back and look at the patterns of gender disinformation, we should really be clear that the goals are to erode democratic institutions and harm human rights, and really move women out of politics and out of having agency. I know we will talk more today about this, but we really want to go beyond just documenting the harm, which is quite pervasive, and moving to a position where we can organize the best practices in response. For the work of She Persisted, we're really trying to center that into the digital rights conversation and reform and remedies. There are a series of actors that are the super spreaders of this disinformation. And so we should not just look at the misogynistic men online, but in fact, the manosphere, authoritarian leaders, a set of illiberal actors who are really fueling this and making it much more dangerous. So I think today we will pull out some of the ideas for pushback that get us beyond media literacy, although at the same time, we do need to engage journalists in being more responsible in the way that they cover this, that doesn't tap into that implicit bias. I just had a chance to talk to folks from Germany last week who are looking at efforts that were similar to what lawmakers did in the US in the 2020 election, which was organize a pushback directly to Facebook, asking them for specific things that they would like to see in the race. And I know that with the increase in disinformation aimed at candidates in the German election, this is something that there is growing interest to bring the platforms into the conversation. I will also point to some really interesting efforts. This is organized by the First Lady of Namibia, who directly addressed those who are attacking her and made the point, which I think is important here, that silence will not protect you. At She Persisted, we're really working in 3 different directions and looking for allies in all of these. One is just understanding the nature of gender disinformation, trying to sophisticate our conversation around it. Secondly, it's supporting the women who are on the front line while we try to get long-term remedies. And then the third piece, which is often left out of the advocacy and civil rights conversation, is bringing in the role and responsibility of the platforms.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that great overview of setting out the terms of the discussion. I think particularly interesting your point about how, female politicians face dreadful levels of online abuse that take a lot of different forms. Shamaila, I wonder if we could bring you in, just kind of reflecting on your work, looking at cyber harassment, particularly where there's kind of similarities and differences between that sort of abuse and gender disinformation and how it affects individuals.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Christina, for that excellent presentation. I would echo a lot of the observations that you made, especially when it comes to sort of the kind of impact that women in the public sphere have. So we did a similar research to some of the researchers that you cited, which was around the 2018 elections in Pakistan. And we compared the kind of comments that male politicians were receiving as opposed to female women who were also up for election. And it was quite obvious that while the volume of abuse or comments might be similar for both, maybe sometimes more for men, because in the sense that they might be running for prime minister or be up for like the more visible positions, whereas some women are contesting much more less contested seats. But the nature of abuse was particularly gendered, and it was sort of drawing on the same sort of sexist stereotypes, attacking their character, calling them names, and calling into question, for example, how they got the party seat, implying that it was through sexual favors and things like that. So this is, I think, an experience that is across the board. With the work that sort of, and the kind of disinformation campaigns that we've seen, particularly in Pakistan and sort of in the region, is sort of any a woman or anybody who identifies as like a gender minority, when they aspire to a certain level of publicness or politicalness, that is where a lot of sort of where we see that transition from like sort of harassment to much more politicized disinformation, which is much more maybe coordinated and has that sort of level of inaccurate or false information that is spread about them. So that's very sort of, I think, something very interesting that happens, that as soon as there is some sort of probably like sort of grab for power, or they're trying to become part of like the larger mainstream discourse, that is where a lot of this backlash comes. And over time, it's sort of, for instance, we were sort of looking at like whether this is something that is new, and it's absolutely not. Smear campaigns directed at women have existed. For example, when Benazir Bhutto was up for elections in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, it was I think the first prime minister sort of a sort of Muslim majority country. She had like sort of I think this is like old school misinformation, where pamphlets were dropped from aeroplanes and helicopters with doctored images of her, and they were obviously false, but the sort of over time, the kind of like sort of labels that get attached to you, even if they are overtly false, I think they sort of tend to then take a toll and then get conflated with other kind of accusations and political moves that are made. So we've seen in Pakistan this particularly happening, and we see sort of the definition of like sort of, if we expand the definition of political leaders to not just like people who are part of like the mainstream political discourse or running for elections, but for example, women who are part of the feminist movement and leading sort of collectives, or are still part of that public conversation and the public's affair. We've seen now, especially as these conversations around gender feminism are becoming much more mainstream in Pakistan over the last decade, we see very malicious campaigns that are not just designed, and this is where like sort of the trend is also becoming much more dangerous and sadly interesting as well, where it is no longer just about sort of their character. You can call them all the names that you want, and I think they've seen that women continue to sort of occupy these spaces despite these campaigns. We're now seeing the weaponization of sort of blasphemy or accusations that are also sort of coupled with like sort of religious elements. And that can not only cause like sort of women immediately withdrawing from the public's affair, but also very real threats to life. And to their physical safety. And that has become a really sort of powerful weapon, especially when directed against women, because we've seen that when it comes to women, people are less likely to come to their defense or to sort of really point out the obvious that this is false. And it plays on those sort of stereotypes as well that already exist and make sort of interventions much more difficult. And
can I just come in there, Shamila? Yeah. Sorry, I just think is that point about how this is much more than just people saying nasty things online. And I think that's often where sometimes this debate can get a bit stuck, is people think, well, you're in politics, you just have to sort of put up with a certain level of people saying rude things about you. But clearly, you know, from what you've been speaking about, and Christina as well, the threats that women face from gender disinformation are much more serious and much more kind of complex than that. And things are clearly evolving as times change and situations change to become kind of more serious potentially. I wondered if I could just bring in Maria here to ask if you've seen kind of, especially during COVID over the last year and a half now, with so much more kind of things going online, more of politics moving online, if kind of the risks to women have changed particularly, or if you're seeing kind of the continuation of the serious risks that were always there, but perhaps amplified.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and it's really nice to be here. Yes, definitely. Interestingly enough, although we feel like sometimes COVID-19 kind of monopolized the conversation and no other issue kind of passed through public opinion, well, actually, it's not exactly like this. And in the area of gender disinformation, we noticed that there was an increase indeed, and I think that this resonates really well with the parasitic type of nature of disinformation. So disinformation does not operate in a vacuum, and it's very sensitive to the cultural context in which it occurs, and really has the capability to take into account the different issues that are relevant to each reality, context, country, in order to use it and indeed weaponize it. So definitely we have seen at the Disinfo Lab, and we've monitored in our research a surge in gender disinformation during the COVID-19, and for instance applied to the pandemic. So actually anticipating a sort of involvement and responsibilization of women in the pandemic. What is interesting is that basically one way or another women are somehow portrayed in a negative and stereotypical way, because, for instance, they are represented as these evil characters pushing a certain agenda. And here we see both character-based accusations in the form, for instance, of political leaders and individuals that get targeted singularly. And at the same time, we see also issue-related sort of attacks to the feminist movement, in fact, or other sorts of organizations and manifestations that are somehow blamed, for instance, for causing a surge of COVID-19 contagions and that type of situation. So definitely a surge, definitely something that responds to the fact that disinformation in general and gender disinformation in particular does not happen in a vacuum, but really responds really well to the context in which it occurs, which also requires the possibility of elaborating tailor-made solutions that are different to each reality. And finally, one last thing that I would like to say, and the other amazing women in this panel have already pointed out, is the intersectionality of the issue. So the fact that sometimes even for researchers, it risks getting underestimated because, for instance, the political message seems stronger than the gender message. So what I would like to say is to pay attention to the cross-narrative aspects of disinformation, including the gender dimension, and also the fact that this intersectionality plays negatively when we have different layers of vulnerabilities of individuals being targeted. For instance, if the gender dimension adds to the ethnic one, or to the religious one, or to the presence of a disability. So it's a really, really complicated framework, and I will stop right here.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks so much. It's incredibly helpful to as a reminder that when we're talking about gender disinformation, that itself seems like quite a specific subset of disinformation, but in fact covers so many different subsets within it that it's one of the reasons why we're so keen to have more of these conversations so that people are really able to engage with that complexity. I wonder if Gwendolyn, I could just bring you in here and ask kind of from your experience, both as a politician and from your work on equality and working on threats to democracy, from the sort of impacts of gender disinformation we've been discussing, what's kind of top of your list? What are you most concerned about in terms of the political impact or the individual impact of these sorts of disinformation campaigns?
I'm sorry, it's not very clear. You cut very often. I think you asked if I was more concerned about individual or global. Is that it? Did I? Because I really didn't.
Sorry, I'll say again more slowly. Yeah, what are the greatest impacts that you're worried about? Is it a political impacts, global impacts? Exactly. What do you think we should be prioritizing working on?
Okay, I don't really dissociate both. I'm not sure I understand the question in fact, but I don't really dissociate both. I mean, the thing is, the main problem we are facing for the moment is that there's no acknowledgement of it. That's the first fact, is that in the political sphere and in policymakers sphere, there's a huge work to have already this point considered. And my colleague Alexandra Guest, that will speak after, is making a huge work on this on a certain number of levels, being in digital questions or in budget questions, but this gender aspect is always difficult to grasp for most of my colleagues. As you said, I am a member of this new committee, special committee that was created for 1 year specifically on disinformation, and it's not on the agenda at all. And we have to push to have it on the agenda. We managed to have, so there's been since 8 months already a lot of these auditions in committees. We've been through all sorts of topics, but having the gender question as a topic was very difficult. We will have one on 12th of July, but it's the first one. It's not at all on the radar. I also had asked for a special committee on the very precise question of disinformation on sexual and reproductive rights, which is a huge place of misinformation and has been already for years. And we know that you have big organizations helped by funds coming from USA, from Saudi, from Russia, and all of this that is trying to lobby in the European sphere to restrict our sexual and reproductive rights. And I finally got it with the help of other women in this parliament, but it wasn't there again in an agenda. What the men are concerned about is Russia and China and this sort of disinformation, which of course is a threat to our democracies and our European sphere. But the question of the gender main aspect is very difficult. And I think Maria said it, but the very specific question of the gender and the intersectionality, so there you really go into a very high level of unknown for most of my colleagues. And this, when I come in this committee and I try to put on the table the question of vulnerable people more attacked than others, how some of our new rules that we are thinking of, suppressing contents and all of this, could have in fact the opposite effect of even more shutting up women, silencing women, and silencing vulnerable people, and all this is very difficult for most of my colleagues to grasp it. So I would really say that already one of the big work is to really make this be in mind, because if they only organize policy making without this gender mainstreaming aspect and without this intersectionality aspect, they will find solutions that will not only not resolve our problems and not help women be active on digital, in the digital world, but it will even maybe have the opposite effect of worsening things. And now maybe Alexandra can go on these very specific questions of the way that the suppression of contents can be in fact very dangerous.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. Absolutely. Perfect segue to the second half of our discussion, which is we've been talking about the risks and the impact and sort of all of the bad things associated with gender disinformation. So now let's move on to how we fix it, which is perhaps the more urgent question. And absolutely, we have to push to have this on the agenda. And when we're thinking about interventions, needing to really understand how the different interventions we're calling on might affect different communities. So Alexandra, I'd love to come to you. I mean, obviously, gender disinformation is not a new phenomenon. Exclusion of women from politics is not new, but there seems to be a kind of step change in online gender disinformation with the scale and the speed. So yes, what would be your take on from your work on artificial intelligence, on digital regulation? How far is this something we can take action on by focusing on the digital realm? And I've also noticed we have a question in the chat about anonymity online. How does anonymity contribute to disinformation? And should we require people to identify who they are to cut down on gender disinformation? So a specific intervention that would be great to hear your reflections on.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks very much to everybody for the very valuable contributions. I would like to take the question on anonymity first, because it's an important detail, and then come back, to the broader issue. Anonymity, I don't think it would help not to have anonymity online, because anonymity protects the victims, actually. I mean, a lot more people would be victims of online violence if they had to give up anonymity, and if platforms would need to store their addresses, for example. That would be very, very dangerous to give that data to Facebook, to give an ID to the platforms. There has been a huge leakage, which a lot of parliamentarians also have been victims of, getting phone calls now because phone numbers have been leaked. So anonymity is absolutely crucial to protect vulnerable people, to protect dissidents, and especially to protect women. And the intersectional aspect was already mentioned. Actually, there are studies that show that the majority of online abuse is not committed by anonymous users. I mean, there is an issue with persecution or with law enforcement against anonymous accounts, but it is possible to store IP addresses. What we really lack is clear rules and how much time platforms have to react if law enforcement agencies ask for the data. So it's possible to figure out who is behind an account that disseminates disinformation or online abuse. You just have to do it quickly. There is an issue with national law enforcement agencies which are not taking this concern seriously, which just tell women, oh, just leave the internet or something like that. So I think there's a lot of education needed in law enforcement agencies and judicial authorities as well. What we also need are very clear rules for platforms that they need to react to requests by law enforcement agencies or by courts or judicial authorities very, very quickly, and provide that information that is needed to identify users that spread online abuse or disinformation. So it's a problem that is real, but it can be solved otherwise, and giving up anonymity would definitely not help the victims. Coming back to the broader issue, it's not a new problem. It's based on old stereotypes, and that's why it worked so well. But I think for a few decades, we had the feeling that things would improve, and that things were improving. And in the last 10 or 15 years, they haven't been improving. There has been a huge backslide. There's a huge anti-feminist movement, which I think has to do with the fact that more women, more intersectional women are speaking up in public discourse and public debate. And this is something that white men are not used to. And therefore, there's a backlash. That's the more political aspect. We have these extremist right state leaders, which is something I think new, thinking of Trump, thinking of Orban, thinking of Putin, who use this really as a state methodology in order to combat opposition. And that's an important factor. But there's also the way the platforms work. And I would like to come back to something that Christina mentioned very briefly in a slide. And I think it said platform algorithms reward disinformation and online violence for profit. And that's the important point. It's for profit. This is what the platforms make money on. And this is really one of the roots of the problem that we experienced in the past year. And this is what we can combat very easily with regulation. This is something we can cut out, and we need to do that. And we have a legislative proposal by the European Commission on the table in Europe that's called Act and the Digital Markets Act. And the combination of these two legislative proposals gives us the possibility to stop the business model online hate and disinformation or not. So how does this business model work? Basically, platforms like Google and Facebook are data collecting companies and advertising companies. So they collect huge amounts of data on all of us, and then combine this data, creating very, very precise profiles. And they can use this data for other purposes as well. And this will happen in the future. Right now, they're monetizing the data, selling predictions on our behavior to advertisers. And this is new. This started in 2003, 2004, 2005, so the past 15 years, more or less. So what happens? What they need in order to have more people engaging with the internet in any form, with posts, with tweets, whatever, is they seek attention, eyeballs. And the longer people stay online, the more ads they can sell, the more money they can make. So how do you get people to stay online? Using polarizing content, because what we as humans react to are negative emotions: fear, anger, that kind of things. They trigger us to engage with content on the internet and to spend more time there, so they can sell.
Alexandra, I wonder if I could just ask a sort of follow-up question on that. Actually, is thinking about, so a kind of narrative we often hear is, well, yes, okay, platforms are doing this data collection and then they're polarizing content, but ultimately people should be able to say what they want online. People should have the freedom to express themselves. Regulation might infringe on freedom of expression, and if gender disinformation and other harms are a result of that, then we just kind of have to deal with that. I mean, Christina, I know this is an issue you've talked about a lot. I wonder if you have thoughts on that kind of we need free speech rather than regulation argument.
I do. And I think it's really essential that we refine our thinking on that point. We need to balance this theoretical notion that freedom of speech prevails online against the reality of what content is actually thriving: hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy, and for all of the reasons just mentioned, because of the money that this makes the platforms. So we should, in fact, be worried about free speech, but of the women who are attacked and who are silenced online. We're having a very sexist response to sexism online. And we need to connect the dots to our allies who, as was mentioned, may be more interested in Russia and some of the other aspects of disinformation. But if that is their entry point, we can in fact show that it is the tactic of authoritarian leaders to in fact undermine democratic movements that are being led by women around the world. If you look at the Belarusian opposition, Ukrainian MPs attacked by Russia, we can look at a series of authoritarian actors who are using this to play into vulnerabilities in society, and we should instead look at this as a national security issue. When we really look at the evidence too, we see that young women report being discouraged from seeking leadership roles, which limits their freedom of expression. And we see women who are saying they're self-censoring or they're totally disengaging from social media, resulting in this chilling effect of freedom of expression for women, including journalists and particularly minority women, and for women who can't afford to disengage because their job depends on this, whether they are in politics or journalism. So the psychological toll on them is really enormous. So I think we have to sophisticate our conversation around this issue of the hallowed ground of free speech, and instead flip the script to look at who's in fact being affected, and more importantly, the covert political, economic, and social motivations behind that, challenging women's rights and their participation in democracy. So I think we'll be in a stronger position to curtail this type of disinformation when we really look at the harms being perpetuated, and do things like asking the platforms to just adhere to their own rules. I mean, I am incredibly inspired by what I'm seeing in the EU and UK to really focus on harmful content and get around this very binary conversation we've had on legal and illegal content that limits, I think, the creativity. And that work is important, and I think will shape the rest of the global theater for reform around these topics. But at the same time, let's just get the platforms to to implement their own rules. And that was really the message of women lawmakers coming out of the US election, as well as, 100 other women who signed on to that effort. So I think we should, really challenge our assumptions around this topic, go a little deeper, especially when these issues of free speech come up that really have a chilling effect on our sense of how we organize a real meaningful response.
Thanks so much, Christina. And and thanks for bringing up as well the UK-EU kind of political situation at the moment with the different kind of proposals for regulation. Obviously, it's something that the Demos in the UK are very interested in looking, and I know the UK debate around freedom of expression and harmful content and where the limits are very live. So I'd like to perhaps ask panelists to reflect on those two proposals and whether there's enough alignment between them. Whether there should be more. I see Maria has her hand up. So Maria, I'd love to bring you in.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to add on what Christina said by quoting actually something that I found really interesting that Christina recently wrote together with Lucina Di Meco. There's like this sentence that really stuck with me, that is, free speech is not the same thing as free reach. And I think that this is also something relevant to think about, because as we said, the gender disinformation often stays at the intersection between something that is maybe legal but harmful, and people are defending their freedom of expression. However, the algorithmic structure of social media, as it has already been said, really amplifies and plays on negative sentiments, and this is really something that we can and we need to work on. I am absolutely not a regulation expert. I have to say that what I really admire from the DSA right now is the fact that it introduces an obligation of risk assessment on the systemic risks that are inherited in the design of these platforms. And this is really a conversation that we absolutely need to have, that some risks are inherited really with the design and the structure of certain platforms. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We have lots of questions in the chat about the thinking more about the Digital Services Act, but I see Shamila also has her hand up. And Shamila, I wonder if you're in your response also, you could reflect on what's happening in the UK and the EU in terms of legislation, what ramifications that might have for the international community. Will the legislation likely be replicated elsewhere? Is that a good thing? Are there risks with that? I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I also just wanted to comment on what both Maria and Christina were talking about, like the sort of strawman argument of free speech that is always sort of presented, whereas it's really curious that like sort of the free speech of those who are harassing or spreading hate speech is the one that matters, but not the speech of the people who are actually silenced by it. So if we really care about free speech, and if gender disinformation is leading certain people to completely silence themselves, then that's something that should be free speech advocates should be concerned about. But it is sort of devaluing the speech of certain marginalized communities and identities, and that's what is at play. And I think we should call a spade. And it's, for too long we have sort of intervention in this area has been shrouded in this sort of argument. That said, it is very important to point out that at least in our experience in sort of countries like Pakistan or India, we've seen protection of women and children used as this sort of excuse to pass legislation for regulation that actually ends up harming free speech. So there are two, like, sort of obviously we're coming at it from a very feminist perspective, and but the other sort of more protectionist model that also uses sort of this gendered angle to then pass legislation that has sweeping powers in terms of we have like sort of crimes legislation that was passed across sort of the region. And now the second sort of wave of legislation and rules is coming in the form of sort of content regulation and sort of trying to regulate and put obligations on social media companies. That is directly borrowing language from legislation and regulation that has been passed in Europe and sort of their proposals in the US as well. So we have to be very careful about like sort of the kind of trends and the domino effect that maybe stems from some of this. And there are a lot of concerns. So for example, what we see happening in India, where the government is actively sort of using disinformation to sort of raid offices or sort of show up at offices of Twitter, and the way in which the social media companies are then becoming part of like the censorship regime as well, because they want to retain that sort of market as well. It's very complicated in the sense, and I don't have the right answers in terms of like whether the government or the social media companies should have sort of these powers. The sort of answer is somewhere in between, where like sort of the user is centered more. But this is kind of the trend that we see happening, and I'm quite concerned when I see sort of these moves on sort of intermediary liability at times to sort of tackle disinformation or to hold platforms accountable. We might want to come up with a different model for accountability, because even in the US, we've seen like sort of legislation that was passed regarding Section 230 was resisted by to ostensibly curb sex trafficking, was resisted by sex workers and free speech advocates. So a lot of times, like sort of when dealing with speech legislation, you have to be very, very careful, and then also think about the responsibility about the ripple effect that it creates in the rest of the world, because I just end with this, but like sort of countries, like sort of authoritarian countries are very insecure, and when they see sort of the EU holding Facebook accountable and or a social media company accountable, but that social media company not giving them that particular country or that particular government the time of day, they then pass like these sort of legislations to make these companies sort of come to them. And this is a very worrying trend that we're seeing. And I mean, honestly, social media companies and tech giants don't really, they don't have the best sort of morals when put under pressure or when their economic profit model is questioned. So we'll see much more collusion between the state and private companies as we move forward. So we have to be very careful about how this legislation is framed.
Thank you, Shmaila. Yeah, Alexandra and then Gwendolyn, I wonder if I could bring you guys in to reflect on how we can mitigate the risks of legislation, how we can empower users more. I'm also seeing some comments in the chat saying that there's specific changes that are needed in the Digital Services Act to protect women. Alexandra, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to answer the questions in the chat. At least there was one question addressed to me and one that I felt I could address. But I totally agree with Shmaila on the harmful content issue. I think it's very dangerous to first let platforms collect all that data and use this polarizing content to increase their revenues and then say, well, you have to decide what is harmful content and take it down. I think that's extremely dangerous, also considering that those companies are very, very sexist. I mean, there's a US debate going on the sexism in big tech, especially in the Bay Area. Those are hugely male-dominated companies. So I would really, really advise against doing that. That's really, really dangerous. I think we have to deal with harmful content in a different way, and I would like to outline that in a minute. First of all, what kind of changes do we need in the DSA? As I was trying to explain before, we need to address the systemic risks and the systemic incentives for gender disinformation, which is the revenue. So what we need to do is simply to ban targeted advertisement and go back to contextual advertisement, which for a series of reasons has a lot less risks as we are compared to what we are seeing now. So the first thing that is missing in the DSA that only has transparency provisions on advertising is to really have a ban on targeted advertising, which is extremely harmful, especially for women, but for societies as a whole. And it's pushing disinformation, it's pushing pushing hateful speech very strongly. We need to get rid of it. Second point, transparency on recommender systems. There are some provisions in the DSA on this which are good. So access to data, access to how the recommender systems work. Just to give you an example, in Germany, 1/3 of Facebook groups are extremist, and 64% of the members of those groups have been sent to that groups, have joined those groups upon a recommendation by Facebook itself. So this has to stop as well. And in order to really know what's going on and not having just anecdotal evidence, but real studies, we need to access that data. We need access for vetted researchers, for investigative journalists, and we need a mechanism to do that. Someone mentioned the risk assessments, which are in the DSA, which are a good start, but they have to be done by the companies themselves. And I really doubt that platforms like Google or Facebook will say, oh, our business model is really a threat to democracy and we should get rid of it. This is never going to happen. This is why in the DSA, we have an Article 28, which foresees independent audits. But at the moment, nobody really knows how to do that. So we are coming up with a very detailed proposal on how audits could work. But what we need for that is public oversight. You can't just leave it to the private sector to oversee those kinds of companies. So what we need is an independent agency that could say, well, we need this kind of audit, that kind of audit, because platforms have different risk. And I think gender disinformation is a risk that most audit companies that are around now, which are basically the big four auditing companies, wouldn't even consider. So we need to make sure it's considered. We need to make sure we have public oversight. So I think these are the changes to the DSA that are very important. And just very briefly, and then I shut up, on civil society, since that was a question in the chat, I think two things. One thing is look at the business model, look at the economic aspects, because the problem we have right now that we discuss the gender disinformation or the online abuse against women very separately from the business model. And this is why they can carry on, because nobody makes the connection. So some people from the more economic point of view, working more on that aspect, sort of know about this business model, but the people who are really most affected by it don't study it, don't know it. And I know it's difficult because it's transparent, it's complicated, but it's not that complicated. So if civil society organizations could engage with that, we are working on studies that we will publish in September, but this is really the topic we need to look into and everybody needs to look into. Second point, I'm trying to come up with amendments. I think somebody mentioned the codes of conduct and code of practice, which are the instruments of the European Commission together with the platforms to try to reduce disinformation and hate speech with controversial outcomes. I think this is the point, and on harmful content, on terms of services, where we could come in with civil society. For example, I'm thinking of suggesting Citizens Council to oversee the implementation of the codes of practice in Europe. This is a little bit nerdy for those but who are familiar with the legislation. This could be a very interesting proposal. We have seen Citizens Council coming up with very good solutions in Ireland, for example, in France. And we could do that within the DSA in order to have a look at the outcome of our ways to tackle disinformation and to tackle hate speech. I think that's an interesting approach. And so I'm very open for suggestion if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Gwendolyn, I wonder if I could bring you in also to reflect on how can we get this point that Alexandra has made, how can we get citizens more involved in empowering users online and in designing the ways that we think platforms should operate? Hand over to you for some final reflections.
I think the second part of the discussion really showed the two traps, the two way of twisting the debate we can fall in. Indeed, there's the free speech issue that is denying the reality of what is the free situation, and we're not in a situation of equality. We're in a situation where everything has been built by white men, most of it, and is used by white men and sold for white men. So it's the free speech doesn't exist from that moment. And then the other trap is, of course, the one of we need very strong regulation and we need very strong and even a bit of censorship, because this is what will protect vulnerable people, which which is instrumentalized by authoritarian countries. I think it was really well said before. It's sometimes a real collusion between the platforms and the authoritarian countries, and we can see more and more that some communities are really the first one to be censored when it's comfortable for everyone to do so. But at the same time, if a woman in a certain number of cases about platforms, women have been persistently asking this platform and saying, you know, I'm facing this, will you do something? And nothing is done. So we're in this very paradoxical situation where governments are at the moment making more and more restricting laws, and at the same time the platforms are not putting the human resources to really deal with the situation. So I would say one of the first important things is human resources, and not filters, not automatized filters. It's been said by Alexander already and others that we know that also the platforms are constructed in a way, and there's no transparency on this algorithm, that in fact are reinforcing these gender and intersectional discriminations. We need training skills for enforcement and justice people and police people, because they don't know how to address at all in any of our countries at the moment the online question and the online attacks. And if you go to the police with that problem, you will find no answers in most of our countries, most generally. So we also need, you know, it's good to have legislation, but if once the legislation is there, no one can deal with it, there's no point with it. And then, of course, there's the question of interoperability and the fact that you can choose your platform, and we could have this leverage against the platforms to say, you're not being fair, you're not doing your work of tackling the problems, so I will go on another one. And then, of course, there's more generally, because this is all the technical stuff we can do about the platforms and the digital world. But then, of course, there's all we need to do to change the structures themselves and the society and the way politics are done. And this is, of course, working on content, I think it was one of the comments in the chat, working on who's there, who are the people constructing the digital world. We need more women at every level, in every sort of jobs that is there. We need the algorithm, of course, to be changed. We need education and culture for young people. I think we've all experimented that. I have a young girl of 15, and she can receive really insulting messages from boys, and she doesn't realize how insulting they are. And this is really incredible for me. I mean, I raised her, and what she would never accept in a face-to-face discussion, she certainly finds not that bad as in a text or in a message. And I find that incredible, very, very disgusting way of talking, and she certainly finds it normal. And I think we have a real problem on that. And there was this story in France of this girl that has been harassed, and there was the trial not long ago, and most of the guys said awful things. We need to rape her, we need to kill her, she's an awful bitch and all this. When they were asked at the trial, they said, I didn't feel that it was that bad what I was writing. And it was very clear that they were sincere and genuine in the way that they were saying it. So we have a real problem of culture and education. And just to finish, basically, we also just need gender mainstreaming in politics, in policymakers, in administration, in all the jobs that are dealing with it, police, justice, and all this. Because, of course, until you don't have all the people that the most concerned with it, you have the problems that all these men everywhere, they don't really see the problem.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn, for setting out so great end to our discussion about all of the different ways that we need to be taking action, and we need to be thinking about technical solutions, but we need to be thinking about social solutions, and we need to be thinking about how we can dismantle various structures that exist, and we can't just rely on one element by itself. So we are almost at time. Sorry to questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A. I got very busy towards the end, but really, really glad to see that everyone has been taking such an interest in this topic. So I just want to sort of wrap up by saying thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us today and for giving up their time to speak with us. to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for partnering with Demos on this event, and to all the outreach and events colleagues, and to the tech support team in the background making it all happen. We really hope that this conversation can be a catalyst for more of these kinds of international conversations, bringing together policymakers and civil society to see how we can tackle gender disinformation. So please do keep in touch, share your work, reach out if you'd be interested to kind of be in part of an ongoing conversation around this. And be publishing more analysis on gender disinformation over the coming months. So yes, do keep an eye out for that. And with that, thank you everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day and take care.